Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in, Casper here, and welcome back to Rebalance, the series where we look at underpowered, overpowered, underused and overused weapons in TF2 and ask, but why? I asked in a YouTube poll which weapon of 3 uncommon weapons that you guys wanted to see next, so today we are talking about the Sun on a Stick, a melee weapon for the Scout. But first, spring has officially sprung, and whether you're an anime fan, an admirer of British nature lover Collingwood Ingram, or you just think that cherry blossoms are actually kind of pretty, then you might be interested in this spring season limited edition Sakura Casper t-shirt, button badge or mugs. Available only until the end of April on my Crowdmate store, linked in the top right corner of the screen right now and in the description. So please do consider checking it out. Anyway, the Sun on a Stick. Let's start at the obvious place and take a look at the stats. The positive attributes are plus 25% fire resistance whilst deployed. In other words, only whilst this is the actual weapon in your hands, so no effect if you've got your scattergun or your pistol out. And the second positive effect is that it crits burning players. A crit, of course, being 3 times regular damage. And these positive attributes are balanced out by a 25% damage penalty. And yes, that damage penalty does affect the crit damage. Now on paper, that doesn't sound like too much of a drawback for the bonuses that you get. But we do need to read between the lines to really understand this particular weapon. Because unlike every other class in the game except Spy, Scout has got a lower base melee damage of only 35, compared to other classes 65. So when we take that nearly 50% lower damage and the Sun on the Stick's 25% damage penalty, this weapon is actually only doing 26 damage per hit to a non-burning player. This also means that rather than the very powerful 195 we know and love from standard melee crits, the Sun on a Stick will only do 79 damage when it crits. Suddenly, the bonus of critting burning players doesn't sound so appealing. And we haven't even started talking about how situational such an attribute can be. Now, credit where it's due, Scout's lower melee damage is at least slightly offset by the fact that he's got a faster attack interval, which means that he swings more often and therefore deals damage more frequently. But we are still talking about nearly 6 seconds of melee swings to kill a non-burning heavy, for example. Long-term viewers will know that I always say that there's 3 typical reasons for you to use your melee weapon in Team Fortress 2. Number 1, if your other weapons are not efficient at close range. This is more relevant to classes like Soldier and Demoman or the Sniper. Number 2, if you've got no ammo loaded in your primary and or secondary, and it's easier or quicker for you to engage at close range than it would be to reload those weapons. Or number 3, your melee weapon has got some sort of extra function that's relevant to the situation. And a perfect example of this is the Sun on a Stick, whose extra function of critting burning players means that it's a useful weapon to pull out in a situation when you are engaging with the burning player. But even though that reason 3 obviously applies here, the problem is that reason 1 doesn't apply. In fact, reason 1 super doesn't apply, because most, if not all, of Scout's primary weapons are at their most effective at close range, and even his secondary pistols are decent. A point-blank scattergun shot will do up to 105 damage, which is of course whether that player is burning or not. Now, to be fair, that is only if you hit every single pellet, so let's say for example that you only hit 75% of your pellets. Incidentally, that quite conveniently means you'll be doing around 79 damage, which is exactly the same as the Sun on the Stick. So really, as a melee weapon, specifically against burning players, the Sun on a Stick is at best equal to your scattergun. Ultimately, this means that the only objectively better time to bring out your Sun on a Stick is if you've already expended all of the ammo from your primary and secondary if applicable. You can get into melee range quicker than you can reload either of your other weapons, and the enemy happens to already be on fire. Now, I'm not saying that this scenario never happens, and it's not like this weapon is completely useless. You can absolutely play to its strengths, and say follow a pyro teammate around and try and clean up after him. Or you can actively work with a friend who's playing pyro and is setting you up for kills. But even with the other positive attribute of 25% fire resistance, I just can't see why you would choose this over almost any other scout melee, which each have their own, less situational utility values, such as triple jump, or causing bleed at a distance, or making an enemy take mini crits from all sources. And that 25% fire resistance, by the way, is the difference of just 1 HP less afterburn per second. And of course it also requires you to be actively wielding the sun on a stick to activate it. So let's think about that for a moment. To get the fire resistance, you have to put away all of your offensive weapons and pull out the weapon that is only effective against a player who is on fire, whilst you're being attacked by the one class who cannot be on fire. Unless of course he happens to be covered in gas pass or goop. Again, it's not like that never happens, and it's not like there won't be times where you only just survive a long afterburn escape because you pulled out this weapon as you ran away on fire. But compared to the alternative weapon choices with more wider ranging applications, I just find it really hard to justify. So if it wasn't obvious already, I consider this weapon to fall into the underpowered category. It's not useless, but it's just not good enough compared to its peers. So let's start the fun part, trying to fix it. As always, I'm not here to say that I think I know best. I'm just here to offer up some ideas and hopefully promote some healthy discussion on the topic. This item does have a very clear theme that I think it's important that any rebalance or rework keeps in mind. Fire. It's called the sun on a stick, and we can only assume that the end of that stick is hot. So let's go through some rebalance concepts that I prepared earlier. Idea number 1 is a pretty simple one. Change the attribute of crit if the enemy is on fire to crit if you are on fire. Not only does this mean that the passive fire resistance attribute is actually working alongside the crit damage attribute, but I feel like being on fire yourself is a situation that you've got much more control over creating because you and your target are the only people involved. You no longer need to rely on a fire creating teammate to set you up. Idea number 2 is a complete rework, and it's playing around with the idea of the Boston Basher. Basically, instead of causing bleed, you cause burn. In other words, on hit, burn target. On miss, light yourself on fire. Before the sun on the stick was added to the game, it was actually originally planned to be a Boston Basher reskin. So this concept would actually take it back to its roots, whilst also staying true to its clearly fire-themed aesthetic. Idea number 3 is another rework. Hitting a burning teammate will extinguish them and store the flame in your weapon, similar to the Man Melter but with flames instead of crits. This would have some sort of obvious visual cue, like the burning arrow of an ignited huntsman. I think that this concept would still promote teamwork just like the original attributes do, but in a slightly more practical scenario. We could still apply the 25% damage penalty without that actually affecting the utility of the weapon, which is of course to light people on fire. Unlike the original attributes, where the negative attribute almost cancels out one of the main positives. And finally, idea number 4, which is again a rework. The attributes will be the third consecutive hit always causes burn. This is based on the mechanic from the Gunslinger, where the third consecutive hit always crits. Again, we could still balance this out with the 25% damage penalty, because the idea will be to run in with this drawn, hit 3 times to cause the burn, and then switch to your primary or secondary to continue the fight. So there we are. The sun on a stick is a weapon whose kind of useful mechanics are just too situational and unoptimized to be chosen over his other melees. I've come up with some potential rebalances and reworks, but of course I'd love to know what you think. Does one of my ideas stand out to you? Do you have an idea of your own? Or maybe you think it's already strong enough and I'm just a big idiot noob who shouldn't be sharing his opinions on YouTube. Of course, if you don't think that, you can check out my limited edition Sakura Casper t-shirts, mugs and badges, linked on screen right now and in the description. You can also subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, watch the other videos in this series linked on screen, or perhaps watch this video that YouTube thinks that you might like. Anyway, thanks everyone, and I'll see you soon.